The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the sand dunes of Kuwait. But above the golden horizon, a new kind of hunter emerged. Unlike the massive tanks that the Soviets had built by the thousands, this hunter did not roll on tracks or roar with heavy engines. It flew. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, nicknamed the Warthog, was not just another aircraft. It was a flying gun designed with one singular mission: to destroy tanks. When American pilots took off in these machines during Desert Storm, they carried a weapon so fearsome that Soviet military advisors who had studied the T-72 tank for decades were left astonished. The Warthog's most famous weapon was the GAU-8 Avenger, a 30mm rotary cannon that could fire 3,900 rounds per minute. Each shell was capable of penetrating armor that most other aircraft would have struggled against. Engineers who had devoted their lives to perfecting the T-72's defenses could scarcely believe that a plane could target their tanks from above with pinpoint accuracy and survive the intense air defense networks in the region. It was a collision of two military philosophies. The Soviets built numbers and heavy armor, while the Americans built precision and survivability in the sky. Even before it reached the battlefield, the A-10 was revolutionary. Its design focused on durability above all else. The cockpit was encased in what pilots called the titanium bathtub, a protective shell that could withstand hits from heavy machine gun rounds. Fuel tanks were self-sealing, and critical systems were redundant, allowing the plane to keep flying even after sustaining serious damage. Soviet observers were baffled. How could a relatively small aircraft endure what would destroy other jets? The answer lay in careful engineering decisions that prioritized pilot safety and aircraft resilience over speed or stealth. What made the Warthog even more astonishing was its simplicity under pressure. Unlike modern aircraft that rely on complex computer systems, the A-10 could continue to fly in manual reversion mode if hydraulics or electronics failed. A pilot could literally steer the plane with raw mechanical controls while continuing to engage targets. During Desert Storm, this feature was not theoretical. It saved lives and ensured that the Warthog could return from missions that would have been fatal to other aircraft. Soviet advisors, watching from intelligence briefings, struggled to reconcile their understanding of air and armored warfare with this seemingly indestructible flying tank killer. In the early days of the conflict, A-10s flew low over the desert, scanning for the familiar shapes of T-72s and other armored vehicles. The roar of the GAU-8 Avenger cut through the air, a terrifying sound to any tank crew. Pilots reported that many tanks simply could not respond fast enough. The A-10's ability to loiter over the battlefield, fire, and retreat with minimal risk of being shot down was unprecedented. For every Soviet tank designer who had spent years optimizing protection and firepower, this aircraft represented a puzzle they could not solve. How do you defend against something that doesn't behave like any weapon they had ever seen? By the end of Chapter 1, the story of the A-10 was already being written into military legend. It was not the size of the weapon that shocked observers, but its engineering brilliance, its focus on survivability, and the audacity of its design philosophy. In the sands of the Middle East, the Warthog had introduced a new era of warfare, where agility, armor, and precise firepower from the sky could outmatch even the most formidable tanks. The Soviets had built thousands of machines designed to dominate the ground. The Americans had built a flying gun that turned the battlefield upside down, leaving engineers and advisors alike stunned at what sheer ingenuity and daring could achieve.
The A-10's reputation as a nearly indestructible aircraft was no accident. Every inch of its design was calculated to survive what would destroy other planes. At the heart of this resilience was the cockpit, famously nicknamed the titanium bathtub. pilots sat inside a shell of 1,200 pounds of solid titanium, strong enough to stop armor-piercing rounds fired from the front and sides. Around it, layers of armor and redundancy ensured that a pilot could continue the mission even if surrounding systems were destroyed. Soviet military engineers who had meticulously analyzed tank survivability for decades found themselves stunned by the audacity of these design choices. How could a plane so exposed to enemy fire withstand such punishment and still return safely to base? The A-10's engines were mounted high on the fuselage, away from the most likely threats on the ground, and its landing gear was reinforced for rough terrain. Fuel tanks were self-sealing, a feature borrowed from World War II fighters, which meant that even a direct hit would not necessarily result in catastrophic fire. Critical systems were duplicated so that if one component failed, another could take over. Every aspect of the aircraft was created to survive the brutal environments of desert warfare and dense air defense networks, from anti-aircraft artillery to surface-to-air missiles. This focus on survivability rather than speed or stealth was something the Soviets could not easily conceptualize. Perhaps the most remarkable innovation was the A-10's ability to continue fighting under extreme damage. Pilots recount stories of returning to base with significant parts of the aircraft shredded, hydraulic lines severed, and yet the plane remained controllable. The titanium cockpit, combined with the strategic placement of vital systems, meant that even near-fatal hits could be endured. In military briefings, Soviet advisors struggled to explain this paradox: a relatively slow, bulky aircraft that could fly low, take multiple hits, and still dominate armored units on the ground. It challenged every assumption they had about air combat and armored warfare. The plane's weapons system also played a critical role in its legendary durability. The GAU-8 Avenger, the massive 30mm rotary cannon, was integrated directly into the aircraft's structure, minimizing vibration and recoil that could otherwise compromise control. Each 3,900 round per minute burst was designed to penetrate armor from above, targeting the weak points of tanks like the T-72. While Soviet engineers had focused on frontal armor and countermeasures, the A-10 exploited vulnerabilities that tanks had not been designed to defend. Pilots described the thrill and tension of flying just hundreds of feet above desert sands, tracing their rounds to track the tanks, confident that the Warthog could survive hits that would end other missions instantly. Even beyond the battlefield, the psychological impact of the A-10's armor and survivability was immense. Tank crews and commanders realized that no matter how fortified their position, the Warthog could appear overhead, fire with terrifying accuracy, and escape with minimal risk. It forced new tactics and instilled a level of fear that few armored units had ever experienced. The Soviets could calculate the destructive power of the cannon, but they could not account for the aircraft's resilience. Each mission demonstrated that engineering, combined with tactical daring, could redefine the relationship between air and ground forces. By the end of Chapter 2, it was clear that the A-10 was more than a gunship. It was a fortress in the sky. Every detail, from the titanium cockpit to self-sealing fuel tanks and reinforced landing gear, contributed to a legacy of survivability unmatched in modern aviation. The aircraft was built not for speed or elegance, but for one mission: to dominate the battlefield and protect its pilot against impossible odds. Soviet observers could only watch in awe and disbelief as the Warthog proved time and again that daring engineering and careful planning could create a machine that refused to be destroyed. Flying low over the desert, the A-10 Thunderbolt II faced some of the deadliest air defenses of the early 1990s. Surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft guns, and radar-guided weapons were everywhere, yet the Warthog continued its mission with a level of resilience that left observers in disbelief. A critical factor behind this was a feature that few other aircraft possessed: manual reversion. This system allowed pilots to control the aircraft without relying on hydraulics or electronic flight systems. In other words, even if most of the plane's control surfaces or systems were damaged, the pilot could still fly, maneuver, and engage targets using pure mechanical input. During Desert Storm, this feature was not just theoretical, it was a lifesaver. Pilots recount missions where flak tore through the fuselage and hydraulic lines were severed. In other aircraft, such damage would have resulted in immediate loss, but in the Warthog, manual reversion allowed pilots to maintain control, guiding the plane back to base while continuing to fire on enemy armor. The Soviets, who had spent years perfecting tanks and studying aerial combat, could scarcely understand how an aircraft could survive hits that would down jets 10 times faster and more maneuverable. The ingenuity of manual reversion lay in its simplicity. Mechanical linkages connected the pilot's controls directly to the flight surfaces. Every pull of a stick or twist of a pedal translated into movement of the plane's ailerons, elevators, and rudder. It required skill, focus, and courage, but it gave the pilot a level of survivability unmatched by any other aircraft in the conflict. Even under extreme stress, the Warthog could continue to operate, fire its GAU-8 Avenger cannon, and retreat from danger. This blend of rugged engineering and human skill created a partnership that no electronic system could replicate. Combat reports highlight how this capability altered the dynamics of air-to-ground warfare. Soviet T-72 crews, expecting air attacks to be deterred by heavy fire, often found themselves targeted repeatedly by A-10s that could survive damage other planes could not. Pilots could fly straight through intense anti-aircraft fire, assess the battlefield, and make precise attacks while knowing that even if systems failed, the aircraft could still respond. The Warthog was not invincible, but manual reversion made it extraordinarily resilient, turning every pilot into a formidable force against armored units. Engineers who studied the plane were particularly impressed by how redundancy and simplicity worked together. While modern jets relied on computer-assisted controls, the A-10 was designed to ensure that no single failure could prevent mission completion. This approach was a stark contrast to Soviet design philosophy, which prioritized heavy armor and electronic targeting, but often assumed ideal conditions for the vehicle. The Warthog challenged these assumptions, proving that durability and adaptability could outperform brute force in high-stakes combat. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect was the psychological effect on both sides. American pilots gained confidence knowing that they could continue flying even under catastrophic damage, while enemy forces realized that no amount of anti-aircraft fire could guarantee safety. Manual reversion turned the Warthog into more than just a flying weapon. It was a symbol of resilience, engineering genius, and the human ability to adapt to extreme conditions. By the end of Chapter 3, the A-10's manual reversion had cemented its reputation as a plane that could not be easily defeated. It allowed pilots to take on heavily defended targets, survive the impossible, and return to fight another day. The Soviets, watching from afar, had no ready explanation. Here was an aircraft that relied not on speed or stealth, but on ingenuity, engineering, and sheer pilot skill to dominate the battlefield. It was a new paradigm in aerial warfare, one that combined human courage with mechanical precision to astonishing effect.
As the sun rose over the desert battlefield, the first A-10s spotted columns of T-72 tanks moving cautiously across the sand. These tanks, the backbone of Soviet armored doctrine, were designed to withstand direct hits and dominate ground combat. Yet the pilots flying the Warthogs had an entirely different advantage: speed, precision, and a weapon specifically built to exploit the tank's vulnerabilities. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon could fire thousands of 30mm shells per minute, striking armor from above where protection was weakest. It was a clash not just of machines, but of philosophies. Soviet engineers had built heavy, resilient vehicles, while American pilots had crafted a flying predator with unparalleled lethality. Engagements between the A-10 and T-72s quickly became the stuff of legend. Pilots flew low and slow, carefully maneuvering to line up the perfect shot. Tank crews attempted evasive movements, relying on frontal armor and heavy firepower, but the Warthog's ability to strike from unexpected angles neutralized their advantages. From the air, the battlefield looked like a chessboard, with the A-10 as the unpredictable piece moving in ways the enemy had never anticipated. Soviet advisors monitoring the conflict were astonished. Despite having thousands of tanks and fortified positions, their carefully calculated tactics were being rendered ineffective by a single resilient aircraft. One of the most remarkable aspects of these encounters was how the A-10 combined firepower with survivability. Pilots could take multiple hits from anti-aircraft fire, sometimes even from tank-mounted weapons, and continue to engage their targets. The titanium cockpit, redundant systems, and manual reversion controls ensured that the plane could survive in conditions that would destroy other aircraft. Every sortie demonstrated that even the most formidable tank could be neutralized if the attacker had precision, resilience, and audacity. For Soviet engineers, it was a revelation. Their designs had not accounted for an enemy capable of exploiting every weakness with such relentless efficiency. The clash also highlighted the ingenuity behind American tactics. A-10 pilots did not merely rely on brute force. They coordinated attacks with ground forces, identified weak points in enemy formations, and used the terrain to their advantage. Pilots would sometimes circle over a target area for minutes, observing movement patterns, calculating angles of attack, and selecting which tanks to strike first. Each decision was critical. A single miscalculation could mean exposing the plane to enemy fire. This combination of reconnaissance, timing, and precision fire made the Warthog far more lethal than any single weapon system on the ground. Soviet observers were left scrambling to explain how a plane, slower and seemingly more vulnerable than other jets, could consistently outmatch their most advanced tanks. Even more striking were the reports of tanks that had been repeatedly hit yet did not explode or fire back effectively. Pilots noticed that the T-72s, designed for brute force endurance, were incredibly vulnerable to sustained, accurate strafing. It wasn't sheer firepower that won the day. It was the A-10's ability to survive, adapt, and strike with precision over and over. Engineers back in Moscow had never encountered a machine that combined lethality and invulnerability in such a terrifyingly effective package. By the end of these engagements, it became clear that the A-10 had redefined the rules of air-to-ground combat. It was not just about destruction, but about strategy, resilience, and psychological dominance. Soviet T-72s, once symbols of invincibility, were forced to confront a reality they had never trained for, an aerial opponent that could strike, survive, and return again, over and over. The Warthog's combination of firepower, armor, and pilot skill had created a paradigm shift, leaving engineers and advisors alike in stunned disbelief. Even years later, military analysts would study these battles as a case study in how innovative engineering, audacious tactics, and fearless piloting can overturn conventional assumptions on the battlefield, proving that ingenuity often outweighs brute strength.
As Desert Storm drew to a close, the impact of the A-10 Thunderbolt II on the battlefield was undeniable. Pilots had flown hundreds of missions, taking on T-72 tanks, armored personnel carriers, and entrenched positions, often under heavy fire. The plane's unique combination of firepower, durability, and adaptability had not only destroyed enemy vehicles, but had fundamentally altered how warfare was understood. Soviet advisors who had spent years studying armored combat were left stunned, realizing that no amount of armor, numbers, or conventional tactics could easily counter the Warthog. The A-10 had created a new benchmark for close air support, one that would influence military strategy for decades. The legacy of the Warthog extended far beyond the desert sands. Pilots reported surviving situations that would have downed any other aircraft thanks to the titanium cockpit, redundant systems, and manual reversion flight controls. Each successful sortie reinforced the idea that engineering focused on survivability could transform the battlefield. In after-action reports, commanders emphasized that the A-10's presence had a profound psychological effect on enemy forces. Tank crews often surrendered or abandoned positions simply because they knew the Warthog could appear overhead at any moment, strike with devastating accuracy, and escape relatively unscathed. This combination of fear and destruction became a force multiplier, amplifying the effectiveness of U.S. ground and air operations. The aircraft's influence was also felt in military engineering and design. Lessons learned from the A-10's performance in Desert Storm informed the development of new attack aircraft and close air support strategies around the world. Emphasis shifted toward survivability, pilot protection, and precision firepower rather than relying solely on speed or stealth. The Warthog had proven that rugged design, redundancy, and specialized weaponry could outperform sheer technological sophistication when applied with skill and audacity. Military analysts continue to study its engagements as a case study in how a relatively small number of well-designed and expertly operated machines can dominate larger, better armored forces. Beyond the technical achievements, the legacy of the A-10 was also about courage and human ingenuity. Pilots flying low over hostile terrain, under the threat of surface-to-air missiles and tank fire, demonstrated exceptional skill and composure. Their ability to coordinate attacks, exploit vulnerabilities, and survive near catastrophic damage showcased the synergy between human decision-making and innovative engineering. Soviet observers were forced to reconsider assumptions about the relationship between air power and armored forces. They witnessed firsthand that an aircraft designed with purpose, resilience, and tactical flexibility could reshape an entire battlefield. Even decades later, the lessons of Desert Storm remain relevant. The A-10 demonstrated that careful design, specialized armament, and an emphasis on pilot survivability could challenge the most formidable ground forces in the world. Its influence extended beyond the Gulf War, inspiring generations of military engineers, pilots, and strategists. The Warthog's legacy is a testament to the idea that technological innovation, combined with audacity and human skill, can overcome even the most daunting obstacles. What made the A-10 truly revolutionary was not only its ability to destroy tanks, but the way it redefined the relationship between air power and morale. Commanders learned that a single, well-protected aircraft with a relentless pilot could intimidate entire armored divisions. The roar of the GAU-8 Avenger became a symbol of inevitability and precision, a reminder that no matter how well a tank was armored, the Warthog could strike again and again. This realization prompted new doctrines, emphasizing combined arms tactics, where aircraft, infantry, and armored units had to work seamlessly together. The Warthog's legacy also lives in training. Pilots today study the Desert Storm missions to understand decision-making under fire, risk assessment, and tactical patience. The lessons learned extend beyond the cockpit, influencing how ground forces prepare for air threats and how engineers design vehicles and aircraft to withstand real-world conditions. The A-10 proved that innovation is not just about creating the fastest or most complex machine. It's about anticipating challenges, building resilience, and giving human operators the tools to act decisively. In the end, the A-10 Thunderbolt II was more than a plane. It was a paradigm shift in modern warfare. It demonstrated that courage, innovation, and engineering could combine to dominate even the most formidable forces. It left Soviet engineers and advisors in awe, reshaped military doctrine, and cemented its place as one of the most iconic aircraft of the 20th century.
the Warthog's shadow lingers over the desert sands of Kuwait, a reminder that ingenuity in the sky can decisively tip the balance of power on the ground, proving that sometimes brilliance and daring are the most lethal weapons of all.